I think so often what haunts us the most is either our fear of what's going to happen in the future or our regrets over what's happened in the past.
Yeah.
And that keeps us pulled in two directions.
Mm-hmm.
Neither one of those are right here where we are. And
Yep.
right here where we are is the only place from which we can make our decisions.
Welcome to the Minimal Mom Podcast. Dawn reaches 1 million women each month with practical tips to simplify your home. Today, Dawn is joined by Emily P. Freeman, the New York Times bestselling author of 6 books, including The Next Right Thing, a simple, soulful practice for making life decisions and how to walk into a room, and the art of knowing when to stay and when to walk away. With a master's degree in spiritual formation and leadership from Friends University, her most important work is to help create soul space and offer spiritual companionship and discernment for anyone struggling with decision fatigue.
Well, Emily, if we were sitting down at the end of the day at the dinner table and we were going around the table and doing our current highs and lows, what would be a current high and low for you right now in this season of life?
Oh gosh. Well, that's so fun because we used to do this with our kids is, what was your favorite part of the day? And then
Yeah.
sometimes if we were brave, we would ask what was your least favorite part.
Mhm.
But I would say a high right now is it's summertime. I love summertime,
Yeah.
and I'm so glad it's finally upon us. But with that is, I guess maybe a low right now is, so I have twins who are 20, and our son is almost 18, and so he's heading into his senior year, so that means he's still around. But my 20-year-olds somehow they moved out and I didn't realize it. Like they're just not coming home for the summer for the first time, and
Oh,
so
wow.
it's a bittersweet
Yeah.
high and low kind of mixed together.
And they teamed up and they're both ditching out on you in 1 year?
Same time. I can't
Wow,
believe they
that's
did
not
it.
fair.
I
I
know.
have a twin sister and we didn't do that to my mom, so I hope she appreciates
You love your mom more than
that.
mine love
Yeah.
me,
We've
clearly.
since well, if there's any hope, we've since all moved back, like, multiple times, so there could still be plenty of
That's good.
cohabitating in the future. And will they be far away or not too far away?
They're not that far. One is like 30 minutes,
Okay.
and then the other one is up in Boone. We're in North Carolina, so she's up in Boone, which is about an hour and a half drive. It's not bad at all.
No, but it's just enough where you're not having breakfast together, making coffee in the morning, right?
That's
Or
right.
or all the
Yep.
things.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, Emily, we're going to talk about your new book, How to Walk into a Room. I have been riveted. I've been listening to it and haven't been able to stop. And so definitely want to talk about that. But I also love, I mean, your core message is the next right thing, doing the next right thing when we can't see the whole big picture in front of us. We don't always know how things are going to unfold. Will they move back again? Will they not? Is this truly the end of an era for you? And this ties so much into decluttering, though, in simple living. I feel with so many women, we don't trust ourselves to make these decluttering decisions. And so I was hoping maybe you could help us unravel that a little bit today. How do we build trust with ourselves? And specifically, something you've talked about is like looking at the path behind us, using the past data that we've accumulated over all these years of life. How can we use that to help to begin to trust ourselves?
This question of trust is one that has come up over and over again. So, for about almost 7 years now, I've been hosting a podcast called The Next Right Thing. And over time, the feedback that I get over and over again when I invite listeners who are mainly women to trust themselves, man, I get more pushback on that invitation than most anything else I say. And it's so curious to me, but I think it's because sometimes when we hear that, we think like alarm bells go off and we think maybe what we hear when we hear that is trust yourself to the exclusion of everything else.
Mm,
But the reality is, trusting ourselves is not necessarily in isolation to trusting the advice of others, trusting the past, looking back
mhm.
over at what we know before. In some situations, people of faith would say they want to trust in God in collaboration with themselves. So there's lots of areas where we are sometimes both excited and timid, but also maybe really scared to trust
Mhm.
ourselves. And it's so interesting you bring that up in the context of decluttering, because raising my hand here, like I almost always have to have a body double with me when I am decluttering because of that very thing. It's
Mhm.
not that I don't trust myself. And sometimes it's like I can trust myself in the big decisions of life. But when it comes to the smaller things, sometimes I need someone to be like, no, you really can throw that away. This happened just last week. I had to have my friend Ashley come over to help me declutter my bookshelves.
Ooh.
And I had this giant Harry Potter book. It was like one of my kids had it years ago when they were big into Harry Potter. And it was like, I mean, you could use like a 10-pound weight. It was so huge. And she was getting rid of it back in the day. And I was like, that that book was so expensive somebody bought for you for Christmas. And I am hanging on to it because it's such a cool book. I couldn't even lift it. And so, but here it was on my floor in my office because, I'm
Mhm.
always referencing Harry Potter when I'm doing my work. That's not a
Yeah.
thing. But I had it in there anyway. So as
Mhm.
I'm going through, all Ashley had to do was, I was like, so where do I put this book, Giant? And she was like, are you really that big of a Harry Potter fan? One question, and I was like, "No, I am not. Put this in the
Yeah,
get rid of pile."
yeah.
But I think that that, like, little scenario can apply to not just decluttering, but, like, areas where we're trying to declutter our inner life, where we're trying to
Mhm,
get rid of junk we don't need anymore, conversations that we had in the past that are still haunting us,
mhm.
decisions that maybe we made before that we have some regrets about, and sometimes we need someone else to say, when we can't say it for ourselves, like, "You can let that go. It's gonna be
Yeah.
okay."
And I love that you bring up the community aspect of it. I'm sure you've heard the quote that says, grief demands a witness. And certainly, when we're
Mhm.
going through big things and we're grieving things, we need others to witness that and to be part of that with us. But I think every aspect of life does. Decluttering does. We need someone to ask the questions like, oh, so yeah, where are you going to store that Harry Potter book? And how often are you going to refer to it? And it's so funny that when we hear someone else reflecting it back, all of a sudden it seems so clear. And again, you had all of that experience inside of you. You
Right.
knew all that, but there is a part of someone else giving us permission. I think sometimes too, it feels like someone else is sharing their responsibility with us too. Like, hey, if I come back and I really needed that Harry Potter book, I'm going to say that you made me declutter it, right?
Exactly. Yes, totally. 100%.
And so for those of us, who maybe don't feel like we have someone really that we could invite into this, how do you coach women and help them, encourage them to find these relationships in their life? Because we know, I mean, we've never been lonelier, but that should cue to us that everybody out there is looking for a friend right now and a safe person to process with. How do we find those people?
A book comes to mind that's not my own, and it's a book called Start with Hello by my friend Shannon Martin, and the whole book is about how to be a neighbor,
Mm,
and this it's all in the title, Start with Hello, and I would say to anyone who is questioning, like, in the midst of this epidemic, which is now truly that of
yeah.
loneliness,
Mhm.
how can we begin to find people? Not just like, how can I find my people? But people are all around us, and they
Yeah.
might be people who we wouldn't maybe at first glance consider to be our people, but
Mhm.
they are there. And I think sometimes it just takes a little bit of guidance and courage for us to step out and find them. I'll also say, when it comes to trusting ourselves, kind of harkening back to your question before, when you don't have that person in the room with you, when you are having to make a decision, whether it's about decluttering on the outside or on the inside, where is a place you can start? And one of the decision making principles that I lean hard on is one that came to me when I was in the garden center when I was trying to find some plants a few years ago for my yard. I'm not necessarily a green thumb, but who is, right? Gardening is a skill like anything else. It's something we can learn. We're not just born with it. But I was there and I was like, I'm going to buy something for my yard and I'm going to plant it. But I got there and I was like, analysis paralysis,
Yeah.
like immediate decision fatigue. And I almost left with nothing. But this thought came to my mind, and it was this one line: just pick what you like, then see how it grows.
Mm.
And so I picked a few things I thought I liked and I put them in my cart and I took them home and I planted them and I learned something along the
Yeah.
way. And that was when, the podcast was kind of new, the next right thing. And that was a very next right thing principle. Like, I don't know how
Yeah.
this plant is going to turn out,
Yeah.
but I'm just going to pick what I like, trusting myself that I can like something and maybe I
Yeah.
won't like it later, but then I've
Yeah.
learned something and see how it grows. But that's when I realized, like, oh, this applies to so many areas of life, not
Yeah.
just gardening, but also many, many areas. And I think something I've also learned from people who are maybe more naturally decisive than I am is something that they have told me in surveys that I've done is what they attribute to their decision making, like to being able to make decisions with some confidence, is that they have accepted the reality that almost, not all, but almost no decisions are final, and that you can
Mm.
almost always change your mind
Yeah.
later. And
Yeah,
that
that's so
gave me
good.
a lot of confidence to
Yeah,
hear from them, like, "Oh, like, if I do get rid of that Harry Potter book and I end up needing it, I could probably go to the secondhand bookstore and find it again, and it will be there for me. Or if I want to pay full price, if I need it that badly, I can go get it." And so those are the types of things that I think
mhm,
people who don't struggle as much with maybe
yeah,
decision fatigue as I do,
yeah,
they know that already.
Yeah, that's so good. It makes me think of Marie Kondo, who I've often struggled to relate to many of her principles until I got further into simplifying and decluttering. And she'll say, you can thank an item. So if the plant you got at the garden center, you plant it and it dies, and you're like, well, that was a failure, right? Or
Mhm.
you could thank the item and say, wow, thank you. Now I know what grows in my yard, what doesn't, what I
Right.
can manage, what not, and to this actual idea of thanking it that I learned a lesson from you. And that is not what our culture promotes. Like, we are very black and white, like, you made a mistake, now you wasted
Mhm.
money, and many of us grew up where money was the commodity we were most fearful of wasting, right? And that's fine. It was a time, honestly, when we had to be much more careful, most of us, with that commodity, but that is ingrained pretty deeply in us,
Mhm.
that that's the thing we're worried about wasting. So I love that. Let's talk about your book a little bit, How to Walk Into a Room. Why don't you tell us, where did the idea for this book come from?
Well, so because I have been hosting and having conversations about decision making and discernment for a fairly long time, I pay attention to the decisions that tend to trip us up the most, and I
Mm,
include myself in that. And they usually are decisions that are tied up in a commitment we have to a people, a place,
mhm,
or a group of people, or maybe even a belief system, whether that be faith or political or an ideological system. And it's when we begin to question those places, those systems, those beliefs.
yeah,
Those are the decisions that seem to be the most difficult for us to move on because
mhm,
they are so deeply tied to our identity and to
yes,
who we are and often to communities.
mhm,
And so we those are the times when we need a lot of discernment
mhm,
and we want someone to gently point us in the right direction. But so often we are left kind of spinning around in these rooms of our lives. And so I sort of set this metaphor of our lives are like a house and every room holds a story.
yeah,
Some of those rooms we know we belong in and we've been here for a very long time. Other rooms we step a foot in the door and we're like, that's not my room. And we're totally fine walking right out. But then there are those rooms that we've maybe been in for a while. Maybe we worked really hard to get in that room. Maybe we paid money to get there. We went to school to arrive here.
yeah,
So when we begin to question those rooms, when something happens either in us or in the people around us that changes, uh, that and then we wonder, like, "Is it time for me to walk out of this space or
mhm,
not?" It could be a job, it could be a school, it could be a vocation. So what do we do when the room that we're in might be a room where we no longer belong? So
yeah,
that's kind of the conversation. That's where I wanted to camp out with this
yeah,
book, with this particular conversation is, how do we know? Who will point the way? And are there any frameworks or practices we can engage to help us know?
yeah. And all of us have found ourselves in this place. Some are big decisions, some are smaller decisions. I Through listening to the book, I felt very validated through the process of that it is difficult to make these decisions, and that we often, like you mentioned before, we often feel like it's very black or white. It's, I make this decision or that, and then these are the consequences I have to live with forever and ever, right?
Forever.
But
Yeah.
seldom it isn't that clear. And one of the themes that kind of go throughout your book is you talk about one of your children questioning their sexuality, which,
Mhm.
again, it's a Christian book. It's from a Christian perspective. And when we're talking about deep rooted beliefs, I mean, that flies in the face for many of us of, it's one thing when we're removed from it to say, well, these are my beliefs and this is what I think about it. And then it's right here in front of us to actually be like, wait, but what do I believe about this? And we start to realize, oh, those beliefs, I mean, this is hitting close to home. Those beliefs were ones I just kind of adopted from others. This is not something, actually, and you mentioned this, like, I haven't researched this. This isn't. And what sometimes frustrates me, and why I'm getting a little bit passionate about this topic, from a Christian perspective myself, is that often we will go to church and the pastor will say, it's okay to question anything. God can handle your questions, right? We've all heard this. God can handle your questions. But then it seems like, but then there's this subtext of, except not about sexuality, except not about divorce, except not about hell or salvation. Those things are very black and white, and they're very clear. And again, when we're removed from those and those things have not touched our life yet, we can say, like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, got it. Roger that. That's the message. That's what we all do. again, until we are forced to examine this for ourselves. And so a term obviously that's floating around now is like, deconstructing our faith. I don't necessarily love that term because it's kind of negative. I think for me, it's been no, actually figuring out for myself what I believe. And I'm grateful for those who have gone before me and many things that I've learned throughout my life. But there is a point where I have to actually learn these things for myself. And I will let you talk here though. I think the fear though is that the other Christians around us say, "Oh, but wait, you're just gonna now this is affecting you and one of your children. You're just gonna try and line up, scripture or things just to support your beliefs." And so I think that's where all this fear comes in again is like, "Oh, well, you're just gonna, try and find authors and books and things that support your beliefs." But I don't think that's actually what it is at all. I think it's no, I'm actually for the first time really figuring out what I believe and what Jesus actually meant when he said, like, the greatest commandment is just to love, and I'm not coming to bring another religious system. So I think one thing as Christians, I think often we've got it wrong, and I think there's a big apology in here as well for anyone that has felt offended or hurt by the church collectively. And so, how have you began to unravel this for yourself to figure out what your family believes and what you believe in, with the pressure of others around you and their beliefs around this too?
Well, I love your passion on the subject. And I think that it's such an important conversation that we all begin to have. I think for many of us, we grew up where, as you said, it wasn't a conversation that was really center or part of our just normal faith growing, questioning. It was sort of like we had certain things we were allowed to question and then other things that were kind of off limits, or maybe we didn't even consider that they were questionable
Mhm,
until we come across someone who we love, who maybe has been carrying this question privately and painfully for a very long time.
mhm,
And so for me, for a long time, I think what was most important was, knowing people's stances or where theologically, what was the theological root, people who I respected or I'd listened to for a really long time, like how they interpreted certain scripture and
mhm,
all those things. There's something really mysterious that begins to happen when you enter into relationship with people for whom this is not an issue or an agenda, but it is their very life.
mhm,
There's something that happens that softens in us where stance becomes less important
mhm.
and relationship becomes front and center.
Yeah.
I would say our theology has always been influenced by relationship. If you look at scripture, Jesus was deeply relational, and that shows up in the theological explanations and the stories and all the things that he tells. And so I think that the main point of that conversation for me, and we talk about decluttering, and I think this is one of those, this is sort of a spiritual decluttering,
Mhm,
is what matters most here. And I think for me, in those moments when our own child was questioning their sexuality, what mattered most in those moments was not what do I deeply believe theologically point by point. What mattered most was this child sitting in front of me, this person who, as Mr. Rogers said, I have loved into being, this person who is afraid, honestly, for their very life. That's what mattered. What mattered was that this person knew they were deeply loved and seen and held, and that nothing was going to change that.
mhm,
And I knew I had a lot of things we needed, questions we wanted to ask, conversations we wanted to have. But in those moments, some of the things I began to question were, where are safe places where I can have my conversations?
mhm.
And is my current faith context one of those places?
Yeah.
For us, we determined that it wasn't. Unfortunately, we
Yeah.
tried to make it so, but
Yeah.
it just wasn't for us, and I
Mhm,
and I think probably a lot of people can relate to that,
mhm.
no matter where you land, and I think that's something I
Yeah,
wanna emphasize is
yeah,
I think there's a lot of room for a lot of people who need we all need to have this conversation, and I wouldn't, want to tell someone, like, "Here's what you need to believe. Here's how you need to come
yeah,
out on this."
yeah.
I can just say I have found a lot of peace in
Mhm.
changing my mind, and
Yeah,
and that's sort of a way of kind of getting rid of some assumptions that I made about God and God's table that
yeah.
were sort of handed to me
Mhm.
without my investigation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so good. And I think, I'm always aware I was reading a study recently that said a big perception of when you ask non-Christians in our country what they perceive Christians to be, I think it was like 70% of people said that they're judgmental or they're rigid in their beliefs, and it's hard to hear that, right? Because when we look at the life of Jesus and we're like, "Wait a second," but those would never be words that we'd use to describe him, and so I have to be careful because sometimes it's hard, I'm like, to get down on the church and say, "What are we doing?" And collectively, we've done this all wrong. But to realize we are all human beings doing the best that we can. But can we get to a place where it is absolutely okay to investigate this and that it is okay to dig deeper into things? And I love, I had heard Natalie Hoffman from the Flying Free podcast one time talk about how, when she was growing up, it was often not even the actual what was taught from the pulpit, but it was, the reactions then of the people around us. So,
Mm,
maybe something like divorce, they would say, "Well, yes, of course, divorce is okay in the case of abuse or adultery," right? So, yes, that is absolutely okay, but then maybe she would overhear women talking about, "Well, but this person got divorced, and was the abuse actually bad enough, or was this
mm,
this or that?" And so then she began to internalize like, well, actually, there's no situation where divorce is okay. And even though, again, that it wasn't necessarily taught from the pulpit, or if you would look up the church's, beliefs, that wasn't there, but it was this cultural thing of like, no, that's never okay. And
mm.
so again, to create a safe context where we can say, well, let's dig into that a little bit more. And I think I love your humility in this because I do think many of us, as we do begin to investigate it and dig deeper, we're not trying to bend scripture to support our views. We're actually getting a much wider view on things and really realizing that very few things are that black and white. And there is a point where it's guided by our relationship with the Lord and what we're hearing from the Holy Spirit. And so, how throughout this process, though, I know you've mentioned, losing friendships and, obviously leaving a church, like, that's a huge loss. So, how did your family process this?
Whenever you are in a room that especially a room that you love, and you determine that the risks and benefits of leaving ultimately are going to outweigh the risks and benefits of staying. Like it's better to leave than stay. Whenever that happens, it's always such a mixed bag. I've been a part of communities before where I have been the stayer and someone else leaves. And as a stayer, which I think we are all stayers and leavers all the time, right? And we're always staying somewhere, we're always leaving somewhere, and then we're always in a hallway of some place in our life.
Yeah.
But I think as a stayer, I have probably wrongfully looked at those who leave and think like, well, they wanted to go, so bless your leaving, and but you're not really allowed to be sad about it because you chose it. So if you
Yeah.
wanted to stay, you could have stayed.
Mhm.
Now, as someone who had to leave a space that we really deeply loved, I
Mhm.
realized that, oh, wow, sometimes we have to leave spaces that we don't want to leave,
Yeah.
that we wish more than anything could have been a space where we could flourished and grown together and been fully, accepted and supported in a space, whatever the issue is. And so I think that we had to come to terms with the mixed bag of, wow, it's so much easier to leave a space when it was terrible and you hated everything about it
Mhm.
than to leave a space that you loved, that helped to grow you, that you helped to grow.
Yeah.
And so that's been a grieving process, and all of us have had to do that in our own different ways, right?
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
I think a couple of practices that have helped me personally kind of navigate that is making a list, 2 lists actually, of what are the things I'm bringing with me.
Mhm.
And some of those things are names of people who relationships that I have stayed with and people who we have navigated together, even though they decided to stay at that space. Some of the things I brought with me are things that I learned that I never would have learned outside of that room. Um, and so that's one list that I have taken with me, things I've taken with me. But the other list is what are some things that I have to leave behind? And those things could be physical things. They could be actual, like that sanctuary was a place that I loved. We helped paint it,
Yeah.
like this was a place that we really invested time and energy into. So it could be a physical space, something you're leaving behind. But more often than not, when it comes to endings, especially endings that end differently than you hoped for or wanted,
Mhm.
some of the things that you have to leave behind are your idea of what closure looks like.
Yeah.
It's your ability and to tell the whole story. I have to leave behind sometimes my reputation, and I have to leave behind conversations that are had about me around tables that I am not invited to sit at. And those are the things that I think we often continue to carry with us for many, many years if
Yes.
we don't engage a practice of leaving them behind on purpose.
I'm glad you mentioned that because that was something that stuck out in your book was, okay, if we leave, then who's gonna stay behind to defend us?
Yep.
Who's gonna tell the truth? Who's
Yep.
gonna tell my side of the story and not just let all the gossip run rampant or whatever? So to say, "I actually have to be okay with that, and that's part of the process of leaving," that's hard. Oh my
Mhm.
goodness, that is so hard, but again, I was really glad that you acknowledged that because I think that's often a fear that's deep within us that we don't always even know is there. And so I thought there was so much wisdom. So let's talk a little bit about more about closure. When we what does closure actually mean? Because we all say I want closure at the end of something, whether it's a breakup or it's a leaving something or something ending abruptly or it's just a normal ending. My kids are moving out. What actually is closure and how do we glamorize it and what is it actually?
I think we want it to mean tied up with a bow every single possible thing I could have explained, every piece of thing I could have practiced. Like when we move from a house, you have to take everything. I don't know if you've ever moved before, but they don't let you leave the tampons in the drawer and the dirt. Like, you have to take it all. And it's always those last few boxes that you're like, "Why do I have this? It's a bunch of
Mhm.
wires. I don't even know where they
Yep.
belong, what they plug into, but we have to take them
Throw it in.
because
It has
they
to
don't
go.
let
Yep.
us leave them
Yep.
here." So we think closure looks like that, like moving out of a
Mhm.
house and every single thing is at least labeled and put into a box. And sometimes it does look like that. And those are the times when we have a toast and when we throw parties, right? And listen, if you get closure like that, you just wrap your big, beautiful arms around it and take it and run. But usually, closure looks more like what I think it was poet John O'Donohue who said closure is really more like completion.
Mm.
That this is maybe not finished in the way that I would have liked, but it is finished and it's important to name it. And so for me, I have found that closure is in some ways it's a myth because we do think it's like that final episode, that, season finale or series finale of our favorite sitcom. That's
Mhm.
closure, but really it often just looks like, oh, the show was canceled in the middle and they hadn't resolved those storylines, but they're not renewing it and it is
Yeah.
over now. So closure is just, this is over now. So naming that and finding ways to bless the ending we got even when it's not the ending we wanted, I think is a really important part of closure.
Yeah, and practically, what does that look like? I have a friendship that ended, but I never got to actually, tell them why or my side of it or, parenting things or what are practical things that we can do?
Well, I think the first thing is to name that it has ended, because
Mhm,
sometimes we hang on and think like, well, maybe I need to give an apology.
mhm.
Apologies is often a way we try to find closure. It's like this relationship went wrong and I can't name what I would be apologizing for, but I feel like it's probably my fault. So I'm just going to say this blanket sorry. And we carry this like, should I apologize? And listen, apologies are great. And if one is needed, I trust that you are wise enough and discerning enough to figure that out. But oftentimes we just kind of think maybe it's an apology that we need to offer and we think that's our closure. But
Yeah,
I think in reality, naming that actually this thing is done, that's really a first step. And
mhm.
part of that is just acknowledging the ending
Yeah,
and calling it what it is. That
yeah,
really is a practical thing to do. And sometimes we're
yeah.
like, oh, I think that ended. It's just like my girls moving out. Like,
Right.
oh, I think they moved out. And I think if
Yeah,
I keep like waiting, if I keep, it can impact your relationship if you think like, well, they're just gone for the summer. And you're like, well, when are you coming back?
yeah,
You realize you're expecting something that's actually never going to happen. When we don't name our endings properly,
mhm.
then we can get into trouble. Ronald Rollheiser says this: when we don't name things properly, we can get into trouble. Because then it sets our expectations differently than what reality it doesn't line up with reality. So that's the first
Yeah,
thing. And I think the second thing is what I mentioned before is really naming some of those gifts. What are you bringing with you and what are you leaving
mm,
behind?
yeah, that's good.
And having a practice of doing that. In some cases, it could be appropriate to have a physical marking whether it's small or large. Sometimes it's throw a party. Sometimes it's just have a few friends to bear witness.
Mhm.
Sometimes you might just light a candle. Something that you can point to
Yeah,
say, I marked that ending there. It wasn't
yeah,
fancy, but it was true.
I like that. Yeah, I think that's really good. And then let's just talk about the breath prayers and mantras again. Yeah, I'm like pressing you. I'm like, what are the physical things we can do? So, I loved this in your book though of when we are. It's like it's all coming up. I'm feeling frazzled, and it's not even the best time for this. I can't just sit and journal for 4 hours or go for a walk. So, tell us a little bit about this idea of breath prayers and mantras.
Well, breath prayers, it's not something I came up with. This is an ancient practice. And really it's just it's it's prayers of the heart. And this is just what are some things, a phrase or a word or something that's meaningful to you that you can say as you go along your way with your inhale and your exhale. And it can be anything. It can be a lyric, it could be a verse, it could be one word, two words, whatever it is that helps you center in and recognize this is where I am right now. It might not be the room I want to be in. It might not be um, or I'm in a room and I might not want to be here at all. But I can, for now, here is where I am and this is what's true. And I can acknowledge that there is presence with me and I'm not moving through this alone. And so a breath prayer, again, it could be one of the things that I actually sometimes like to do and combined with a breath prayer is one of my favorites, which is engaging 2-word mantras. And when I say mantra, I just mean like something that you repeat.
Yeah.
And so for me, one of my favorite ones, especially in times of transition or in times of, grief or struggle, is the 2-word mantra for now. And this is something you can add to any sentence that's true right now. Like, for example, my kids are really struggling. And that sentence by itself is like, oh, my kids are struggling and that's so hard. But adding my kids are struggling for now is a really helpful 2-word mantra for me because it just reminds me that this is what's true now, but it's not going to last forever, most likely.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I like to add. And then another one is, and that's usually when maybe you're ready to go, but it isn't time. You're ready for this to be over, but it's not time. For now is a really helpful mantra you can add to your true sentences. But when you are maybe it's time to go, but you don't feel ready. You might be invited to engage in some courage. And for me, I have found the 2-word mantra of let go to be really helpful. Like I'm gonna let go of my need to control the situation. I'm gonna let go of my need to know everything before I move. Some people say, let go, let God. I don't love that. Like, no, I don't like that. But maybe let go of my idea of what it means to let go and how scary that might be. So that's another 2-word mantra. 2-word mantras can be anything. It can be me too. Like I said, for now, let go, or praise be, or let's do it. Like there's a lot of ways that you can engage just 2 words that are meaningful to you. But these are just like little ways to stay present, right? Because when it comes to decision-making and discernment, I think so often what haunts us the most is either our fear of what's going to happen in the future or our regrets over what's happened in the past.
Yeah.
And that keeps us pulled in 2 directions. Neither one of those are right here where we are. And right here where we are is the only place from which we can make our decisions. So it's so important that we remember and recognize this right now place.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, obviously we'll link to your book down below, but as I crudely try to tie this back to minimalism and simple living, how I know you live simply too. And so how do you think simple living and spirituality go hand in hand?
Well, one of the things that I have always believed about decluttering specifically is that decluttering is to our home as silence, stillness, and solitude is to our soul.
Yeah.
We are always getting input, just like in our homes. I mean, input is everywhere. When it comes to our physical spaces, it's where kids are bringing stuff home from school. We're getting stuff at Target, input everywhere. Where's the output? Well, that's when we have our spring cleaning. That's when we do our daily declutter, whatever it is. Same goes for our inner life. And I think the input is we had that conversation. We have that disappointment. We had to leave that room. We haven't grieved it. Input. Where's the output? The output is in stillness, silence, and solitude. And those are practices we can engage that can help us release some of the buildup of the things that have cluttered us up on the inside.
Yeah, that is so good. It is true. I think I've often thought it's like chicken and egg. Do we declutter first and that helps us with our mental clarity, or do we have to do the practices, the mindfulness to get mental clarity and then we can declutter? But I think there is something powerful about getting our physical environment in alignment that is just life-changing to our spirituality and our mental space as well. Emily, what an honor to get to talk with you today. Thank you so much for everything that you shared. We'll link to your podcast and also your most recent book. Congratulations on all the success with it and your other books as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us on the Minimal Mom Podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend who might find value in embracing a simplified life.